This notion of spirit that knows itself as spirit is itself the immediate notion and is not yet developed. Absolute being is spirit, that is, it has appeared, it is revealed. This first revelation is itself immediate, but the immediacy is equally pure mediation or thought, and it must therefore exhibit this in its own sphere as such. Looking at this more closely, spirit in the immediacy of self-consciousness is this individual self-consciousness, and so in an antithesis to the universal self-consciousness. It is an exclusive one or unit which has the still unresolved form of a sensuous other for the consciousness for which it is immediately present. The other does not as yet know spirit on its own, that is, spirit as an individual self is not yet equally the universal self, the self of everyone. In other words, the shape has not as yet the form of the notion, that is, of the universal self, of the self that in its immediate actuality is at the same time a superseded self, that is thought, universality, without losing its actuality in this universality. But the proximate form of this universality, the form that is itself immediate, is not yet the form of thought itself, of the notion as notion. But the universality of reality, the allness or totality of the selves, and the raising of existence into an ideational form, as in every case, and to cite a specific example, the superseded this of sense is, in the first place, the thing of perception, not yet the universal of the understanding. Paragraph 762 seems rather short, and at first glance, there's not all that much going on there. But this is actually a really important turning point coming after several other very important turning points. So I think we want to devote some pretty close analysis to this. And when we look at where it ends up in the reference to the consciousness section, right? The this of sense, the thing of perception, and the universal of the understanding. That, I think, takes some unpacking to completely get at what Hegel's doing there. There's a nice, three-part schema, but I think we want to dig in and dive in a little bit and explicate that for ourselves, so that we fully understand what's going on. There is, of course, flowing from this paragraph into the next, a close connection that's happening. And actually the subsequent paragraphs, particularly on this theme of Vorstellung, that is representation, or as Miller is translating it here in terms of ideational form, and maybe we have to talk a little bit about how we translate Vorstellung in this, because he's also translating it, just afterwards as picture thinking. We can also bring in representation. So anyway, there's a lot going on here. So let's look at the text itself. We had in the previous paragraphs a number of different things being brought together in the revealed religion, in the individual human being. And, reading between the lines here, this is Jesus Christ, the Christ of the, religion Christianity, which Hegel takes to be the absolute, the ultimate religion. Not as good as philosophy, by the way. Something that, Kierkegaard and others would sometimes criticize him for. And actually, this is a little bit of a digression here. If you want to criticize Hegel's views on religion, there are a number of different ways you can do this, a number of, at least on the surface, weaknesses or vulnerable points. And, one of these would be to say, well, what's so special about Christianity? And that's what Hegel's been trying to push here in these previous paragraphs. It's different in that you don't just have a God who's up on high, who you relate to through priests or other mediators, or maybe through your own community or your minds or artistic production or artistic consumption. you relate to this as a sensuous human being. And you could say, well, that's all fine and good, but Hegel, you weren't there at the crucifixion. You're relying on all these texts. And Hegel would say, yeah, I know. I mean, I actually wrote something earlier in my career about these sorts of problems. There's the issue of the higher criticism developing. How do we know anything about this? And he's going to talk about that in subsequent paragraphs, right? But you could also say, well, what's so great about having an individual human being here representing things? And that's another area where, Hegel, I think, has some responses. You could say, well, what about other religions in which there is a human, not just intercessor, but somebody who is, the divine incarnate? Well, that's another interesting question to raise. Maybe there's not something so unique about Christianity or the Western consciousness, and Hegel doesn't take that into adequate account. But another charge that you do see Kierkegaard making is, all right, Hegel, you're right. Christianity is really important. Religion is really central. Why are you placing that before philosophy? And essentially saying religion is for the dummies who have to use picture language. The real action is in the notion or the concept. What is warranting you to do that? And so back to the text and thinking about this. If we look at what he's telling us here. So to back up a little bit, in the previous paragraphs we had this incarnate God. And what it was bringing together was, you could say, a kind of, the equivalent of a triad is a quaternade, I guess. So we'll say a fourfoldedness of being, Sein, essence, Wesen, existence, Dasein, and thought, Denkens. And these are connected together, related to each other, and yet at the same time distinct from each other, as we, again, saw in the previous paragraphs. Hegel is still playing off of these. Now, as I pointed out in the earlier paragraphs, Denken, thinking, assumes an absolutely central role. But we can say, well, what kind of thought, right? And here is where we might see something really valuable in this Vorstellung versus, or representation versus Begriff, notion, or concept distinction that Hegel is making. And it's not just a distinction, it's also a movement, it's also a transition, as we're going to see. So we're going to come back to that in just a bit. Let's begin at the beginning. This notion of spirit, right? So the Begriff of Geist, the spirit has a notion of itself that knows itself as spirit, right? Spirit knowing itself as spirit. This is something very important. It's attained a certain kind of articulateness. It has gone through a number of, we can call them supersessions or, transformations, these Aufheben, right? Going from one shape of consciousness, one Gestalt, to another, and from developing the concept in the process. Spirit is what fundamentally is for Hegel. So spirit becoming conscious of itself through religion is going to be really quite important. But notice what he says right after that. Is itself the immediate, unmittelbares, right, unmediated or not mediating notion, and as such is not yet developed. Now, relative term here, not yet developed, right? Is it completely crude? Are we way, way back at the beginning of, putative human history with self-consciousnesses running into each other, looking for recognition? No. We've traversed a massive path throughout, millennia of history and cultural development, right? Bildung. We've developed spirit through all these different forms of itself through which it got to know itself. So we're not at the beginning, but we're not at the end yet. And there is a certain immediacy, a certain undevelopedness to this concept here that is still going to be the actual case, the Wirklichkeit, but is not going to be what is possible, what is being sketched out, the where we ought to be going. So he says absolute being, and now here Miller is taking a little bit of liberty. It just says Wesen, essence, being, is has appeared. It is revealed. And okay, is it that big of a liberty? No, because we are talking about the absolute here. And so it's appeared, erscheinen, ist erscheinen, right? So it has shown itself forth, right? To who? And that's a good question we're going to have to ask in a moment. And it is revealed. Now, the revealed, the ed ending in English makes it sound like something did the revealing, something self-revealed. Again, I've pointed this out. Offenbar. It is in the form of that which is revealed. It is opened up to us. So, who has it been revealed to? The community, the individuals who saw God face to face and recognized God as such, if only dimly, if not fully worked out. I mean, if we're going to think about Christianity, think about the Gospels. If you've ever read them, it's not as if this Jesus, fellow is born and they have a nice Christmas and, the three wise men come and then, boom, he's suddenly, there's in Luke at least there's a passage where he's a teenager, right? And he's in his father's house. They're like, where were you? Well, I was, hanging out in the temple. And then, boom, we're there when he's 30. And now he's wandering around preaching to people. And he tells, for example, Simon Peter and Andrew, hey, follow me, right? And they're like, okie doke, I got a good thriving fish business here, but I'll just leave it behind. And you said so. It's not, when we talk about immediacy, it's not that immediate. Read the Gospels. And one of the things that you see is a not constant, but continual not fully recognizing what the hell's going on and who this guy is and how he's connected with God, right? At one point, Jesus actually tells Peter, who's like, the big guy, hey, get behind me, Satan. You're messing stuff up, right? And one of the apostles is, so mixed up that he actually sells Jesus out at one point. So there's a lot of ways to go wrong with this, even when things are being appeared and being revealed. Now, notice the next thing that he says here. And here, this harkens back to something I said in a previous paragraph about immediacy. This first revelation is itself immediate, unmediated, right? It's boom, right there in your face. You can imagine this Jesus guy. Instead of being like, out there in a rowboat preaching to the crowds and stuff like that, imagine him being there, in the backstage, if we're going to use musical metaphors, and he's talking with his friends, his companions, these followers, and he's like right there in their face, face to face where you can smell the garlic on somebody's breath, and he's telling them things, and they're communicating. Well, that's pretty immediate, isn't it? But even then, there's still mediatedness or mediacy. He says this immediacy is equally pure mediation. Okay, so that's something that we can say anytime that Hegel brings up the immediate. The immediate never remains purely immediate. If you haven't gotten that lesson by this time, at least hopefully this time it clicks. Nothing is ever completely immediate, at least not for long. And what shows us that's the case, that it's not purely immediate? Thought. As soon as we start thinking about things, there is mediation going on. And Hegel right here, in the rest of this sentence, is saying, okay, it is equally pure mediation or thought. Thought is a mediating function, and it must therefore exhibit this in its own sphere as such. Now, why does it have to exhibit it in its own sphere as such? Well, because when you start thinking about things, that changes what you're working with, and now you have to take into account what you're thinking about. And there's, you could say, a certain adequacy that needs to happen here. And this brings up something else that is not being talked about here, but think about the nature of truth within the Hegelian dialectic. It's tempting to say, oh, well, I know all about that. Hegel is a not correspondence theory of truth person, but rather a coherence theory. The truth is in the whole, the totality, the Ganz, the entirety of everything, and everything has to be connected to it. Yes, that's part of Hegelian truth. But there's also another sense in which truth is an adequation, but an ongoing dialectical adequation between our thinking and what we're encountering, including our thinking about ourselves, including our thinking about God. So, quite important here. So he goes on and he says, looking at this more closely, and now we get to, the schema that I've got sketched out here. Spirit in the immediacy of self-consciousness, right? So we've got an immediacy of self-consciousness taking itself as immediate, is this, dieses, individual, einzelne self-consciousness. And so it's in an antithesis, it's in an opposition with the universal self-consciousness. And this universal term here is going to be very important to unpack as well. Allgemeine, right? What does that actually mean? An antithesis to the universal self-consciousness. It is an exclusive one or unit which has the still unresolved form of a sensuous other for the consciousness for which it is immediately present. And here we got to shift things around a bit, right? One and other, this goes back to the nature of self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is itself, what it is through another self-consciousness. It is in its relation to its other. And the same goes for the other self-consciousness. It is what it is in relation to the one or the other self-consciousness. And so there's some flipping back and forth here. And it doesn't actually map on completely, right? Because who are we referencing here? Are we talking about the self-consciousness, the individual self of the God revealing itself as incarnate, as God human, God become man, to take Anselm's wonderful title, Why God Became Man, Cur Deus Homo? Or are we talking about the self-consciousness of the worshiper, the acknowledger, the follower, the believer? Well, it's kind of both, isn't it? And we could actually play this out on both sides. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. Maybe I'll just leave that for you to think through. Let's go on a little bit further, right? So he says, this other does not as yet know spirit as its own. That is, and this is what suggests to us, maybe we should think of it in terms of the believer, right? Spirit as an individual self is not yet equally. Now here's where he's starting to sketch out what the universal self looks like. Is not yet equally the universal self, the self of everyone. Now, this is an interesting way to talk about it. Not the self of the community, right? Not the self of the totality, the Ganzheit, rather the self of everyone, alles, all the other self-consciousnesses. So should this be understood as something, kind of hazy, like a general will a la Rousseau, or, somebody speaking for it? No, this is like a bunch of different people having selves and being together in a community, and maybe something emerges from it, maybe something doesn't. But there is definitely an opposition between the individual and everybody else, although the individual is part of everybody else. So, maybe they haven't yet recognized that they're part of everybody else. They're part of everybody. And there's, viewed as there's a universality here. There's a particularity or individuality here. And the universality should, in some respect, matter more. we also have going on here, so this actually could be the religious revealer who doesn't fully yet grasp what he is, because there's an opposition between him and his self-consciousness and the everybody else. Isn't that a suggestive idea? And this would go against notions where Jesus of Nazareth, as the second person of the Trinity, the Son, is just like knows everything from the start. There is a tension here in Christianity as a religion. That's one that's very much reflected in the Gospels, right? And also reflected in the various letters. This guy suffers, seems to learn things along the way. Very smart as well, speaks with authority, and yet doesn't actually totally overmaster the community. It doesn't come in and everyone's like, oh, listen to this guy. Now we recenter the community completely around him. It takes work, right? So we go on, and here, this is a wonderful phrase. In other words, the shape, the gestalt, has not yet the form of the notion, the Begriff, that is of the universal self, of the self that in its immediate actuality is at the same time a superseded, aufgehobenes self that is thought, universality, without losing its actuality in this universality. Now, is that what we're getting out of the community? No, something else is being sketched, something else is being projected out there. Something that within the Hegelian dialectic is there sort of like as a draw. Think of it like how Aristotle talks about God as that which draws other things to it, right, as a final end. But this isn't being fully understood in that thinking, although thought is the way in which this is going to attain some level of understanding. And this is where I think we get to the most important and interesting parts of this, right? Otherwise, we have this cool dialectic or opposition between individual and community. Wow, that's awesome. We can learn something from that. We can also learn something from that, not just generally, but in terms of thinking about, the Christian community, the early Christian community, and what they made of this person who they're supposed to believe in and trust in, and who's teaching them. That's all really great. But we add in this other element, and you could say the bottom drops out, right? Or rather, something else is restored to what we're seeing. So this entire dialectic here between individual and the universal is spirit coming to know itself, absolute being as spirit revealing itself, and it has a universality, Allgemeinheit. Now, I've said this before in the past. When we see universality is, in some respects, a relative term, right? It's relative to the particulars or individuals that it takes in, but it's also a relative term in that you can have more or less universality. We can talk of a universality capital U versus a universality lowercase u, or if we wanted to sort of paraphrase Kant, think back to the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, right? Where Kant says, listen, morality, not about happiness, that's not the whole point of it, but we can have rules, not maxims, because the maxims are actually for the universal, the morality. We can have, guidelines, you could say, of prudence, right? And prudence is directing us towards happiness, Glücklichkeit. And you can have some general rules, like don't piss all your money away at the casino, right? That's a pretty specific one. Don't waste your money is a little bit more universal, right? But there might be cases where you actually do have to waste your money in order to attain happiness. So it's a general, it's a rule of thumb, as opposed to the true universal, which for Kant means exceptionless, right? So there's a universality, generality, specificity, distinction. It's almost like a continuum there, except maybe there's like a dividing line to universality. Hegel's saying something kind of like that, right? The universality of the universal self-consciousness is not yet full universality, Allgemeinheit, right? And so he's going to bring in a number of things here. He's going to talk about actuality, Wirklichkeit, the allness, the Allheit of the selves. He's going to talk about raising existence into ideational form, the Erhebung des Daseins in die Vorstellung, right? You could say transformation of Daseins, of existence, into representation, which by itself, not a bad thing. That is a really awesome thing, but it's not where we should be ending, right? All of this requires to be sublated or superseded, aufgehoben, right? And so it requires some aufheben going on, but the way that Hegel talks about this is aufgehoben, as if it's almost like past tense, although, it is past tense for us, isn't it, if we think about this, right? These transformations have taken place, not just in our past, but in Hegel's past, so I guess that makes perfect sense. And what are we trying to get to? The form of thought itself, right? We have to get to the notion as notion. Begriff als Begriff. So not just the Begriff, the notion that we started with here, but the real full thing. Remember how Hegel at the very beginning of this says that, here we go, it's not yet developed. Spirit is not yet developed. It's appeared, it's revealed, but we don't have the notion completely unfolded yet. We got to unfold that notion, and that's what happens over here in the more universal universality. And so Hegel's going to give us something like an analogy, or you could even say, reading backwards, an allegory. I hadn't thought about that, but maybe the consciousness section really is an allegory for what's supposed to be happening here. An allegory is a story that tells another story, right? It doesn't mean that the original story is false, but it means that there's more going on, that the story can tell a better, greater story, and perhaps that's what's happening. So he tells us that, to cite a specific example, the superseded, the aufgehobene, this of sense, right, in sense certainty, is in the first place the thing of perception and not yet the universal of understanding. Now, the thing of perception is a universal, right? There's a universal in the different qualities, and the thing itself can be looked at as a universal, both in the development of it and as the example that Hegel's using. But it's definitely not the universal of that most difficult section of the phenomenology, force and the understanding, where we bring in forces and laws and even worlds to make sense of things. There's a greater complexity. There's a notion of notion being spelled out in that, isn't there? And so we can say, well, this is kind of like that. Sense certainty, right? Immediacy. Then we have the community itself, and we've got this cool interplay between the two of them, which can be modeled in terms of individual relations within the community, but also something greater, a universality going beyond it. But that universality, like the thing with its properties, is not yet the whole universality, the capital U universality that we're going to get when we move to, force in the understanding, or in this case, what are we moving to? Well, the next paragraphs. Hegel is going to be saying, ultimately, that the community has to re-understand itself, widen itself, and that this key person, incarnate God, is going to play a role in that. I don't want to give away the ending, of course, spoilers. But let's linger just for a second on this distinction, Vorstellung and Begriff, or ideational form, representation, picture thinking, and notion. Now, picture thinking for Hegel, that is where Vorstellung, picture thinking, or ideational form isn't always the best translation. That works for some things, particularly where the visual is involved. But we can also say that this is a schematic way of understanding, right? So in a certain respect, it's ironic here because anything you can really sketch on the blackboard is not the notion, right? The notion has to be in our heads, so to speak, and in our discourse and our relation with the text and our relation with what's on the chalkboard. What's on the chalkboard is basically just Vorstellung, but it's Vorstellung that can be helpful in understanding what's actually happening. Vorstellung that can be used as a tool to get us beyond mere Vorstellung. And this is where I'm going to end up. This, Aufheben, this sublation or supersession, is really, really important to keep in mind. We are not moving from Vorstellung and saying, get rid of all that crap. We're going to be mystics and just intuit God or something like that. Hegel is not for that at all. Vorstellung had better be incorporated, and it had better be given a greater context, and we'd better remain in relation to it, and yet not reduce the religious object that we're grasping to mere Vorstellung. This is very, very different than saying, well, we leave Vorstellung behind because it's no good. Vorstellung is very, very good. It's just not as good as we'd like it to be. So that's, you can see there's a lot going on in this paragraph when we really start digging into it.